Robert Baratheon rode north with a heaviness in his soul that had little to do with the journey's length. The winter wind whipped at his furs, and the old memories pressed upon his mind. He could see the looming shape of Winterfell in the distance, a dark fortress rising against a sky choked with clouds. The king's party was vast enough, knights and bannermen, servants and wagons loaded with gifts and baggage. But Robert felt alone in the saddle, consumed by the secret he had carried for so long. He remembered when he had learned the truth. It had been weeks after the dust settled from the rebellion, and rumors swirled like ravens in a storm. He never would have listened to talk of Targaryen babes and hidden births had the whispers not cut so close to his own heart. Rhaegar was dead. The Iron Throne was Robert's, and Lyanna Stark was gone to the grave. Yet one day, Varys had come to him in the quiet recesses of the Red Keep, eyes darting to every shadow. The spider had his ways, his lines of information that stretched across the 7 kingdoms. The words had been as quiet as a slippered step, but thundered in Robert's ears like war drums. The boy Ned brought home from the south, the so-called bastard Jon Snow, was Rhaegar Targaryen's son, and Lyanna's. His first reaction had been a fury so white-hot it would have outdone dragonfire, a ragged cry rising in his chest. But something else warred with that hatred. The love he once bore Lyanna. The memory of her face flickered in his mind. He would have killed 1,000 Targaryens for her. Yet she had loved Rhaegar instead of him. It tore at the inside of him, made him want to break everything in sight. But the child, a baby who had done no wrong, carried no guilt but for the blood in his veins. That secret had threatened to set him ablaze even more than his father's hammer once had on the battlefield. But Ned, stalwart Ned, unyielding as the North itself, had begged for the truth to remain buried for the boy's sake. Robert remembered that day. He had locked himself in the Royal Solar, Ned opposite him, both men looking older than their years. In a voice so tightly controlled it barely trembled, Ned had confessed. Lyanna was dying, and with her last breath, she had asked Ned to protect the child. The child that by law, by all of Robert's understanding, should not have lived. Every Targaryen was an enemy. That was the principle that had guided Robert through the war. But there had been tears in Ned's eyes, and Robert's heart had cracked along its old fault lines. In the end, he had relented. They would say Jon was Ned's bastard. They would make sure no one else suspected that the boy had Rhaegar's blood in his veins. For Ned's sake, for Lyanna's sake, Robert had sworn to keep silent. He had meant to keep Jon Snow as far away from himself as possible, for his own peace of mind. Hatred was easier at a distance. But the years passed, and the guilt never lessened. Sometimes Robert wondered if this was the reason the gods had let him grow so fat and tired, as if punishing him for that boy's uncertain fate. He had promised Lyanna nothing. He never had the chance, but he had, in his own way, promised Ned that he would let the secret lie. He had done so for the love he once bore for Lyanna, for the unbreakable bond with the man he considered a brother. Now, as Winterfell came into clear view, the old ache sparked anew. There would be no escaping it. The royal procession threaded across the wide courtyard, steel and leather and harness bells echoing against the ancient walls. Snow melted under the warmth of summer, turning the ground to mud in places, but the air was still sharp. Robert dismounted and found Ned Stark approaching, his face like stone until a brief flicker of warmth broke through. They clasped hands, not as king and lord paramount, but as old friends. Robert cast his gaze about. He saw Catelyn Stark curtsy, a line of their children behind her. Robb, Theon Greyjoy as ward, Sansa, Arya, Bran and Rickon, carried in a servant's arms. Then behind them all, half hidden in the swirl of activity, stood the boy. Jon Snow, eyes as gray as his mother's had been, the winter-dark hair like Ned's framed his face. For an instant, Robert saw Rhaegar's shadow flicker across the boy's features, but it was gone just as fast. The swirl of people, the bustle of greetings, the busy steps of the stable hands, seemed to press in on Robert's senses. Still, he felt a tug deep inside. The child who could have upended the kingdom's tenuous peace was standing not a dozen yards from him, head slightly bowed, as if he expected no better than an afterthought. He and Ned exchanged words of welcome. Robert forced a laugh and clapped his friend on the shoulder, bellowing about how the north was too cold for his southern bones. How he'd have to drink half the ale in the castle to keep warm. He would play the boisterous king for now, because that was easier than facing the knots in his mind. The talk was of pleasantries, of how grand the trip must have been, of how it had been too long since they last saw each other. Ned was subdued, but polite. Lady Catelyn wore a courteous smile. That night, a feast was held in the great hall. Robert made sure to do what he did best: laugh, eat, and drink to fill the silence in his own head. He roared at the jests and teased Ned's children, offering Robb a playful cuff on the shoulder, and complimenting Sansa's beauty. The more wine he drank, the easier it was to pretend. But when his gaze wandered the hall, he found Jon Snow sitting at the far end, not with the family, but among retainers and lesser household folk. The boy ate in silence. Now and then he stole glances at the dais, and Robert wondered if he was looking at Ned, or perhaps envying the place of his half-siblings. Raising his goblet, Robert swallowed thickly, letting the sour taste of the wine wash down the bitter lump in his throat. If circumstances had been different, would Jon have been recognized as a prince? Would Robert have ordered his death outright once he learned of him? Had Ned not intervened? The idea twisted his insides. Sullen, he drank more, until the clamor of the feast blurred into an unsteady swirl of sound. Still, Robert was king, and there were duties to attend to, including asking Ned to be his hand. There was also the matter of a potential betrothal, his son Joffrey to Ned's daughter Sansa, and the question of the old wardship and alliances. But that could wait until the morning. The mood in the hall was thick with warmth and the smell of roasting meats. Servants rushed about with platters, and the minstrels took up a lively tune. Robert forced one last laugh, though it stuck in his chest. Later, after the feast, Robert found himself in the solar reserved for the lord of the castle. A fire crackled in the hearth. Tapestries of the direwolf sigil hung on the walls. He had dismissed his guards to wait outside. Ned was there, standing beside a window, his posture tense. Robert sank into a large wooden chair, rubbing a hand across his face. "7 hells, Ned," he said, voice quiet. "It's cold up here. You never told me it would be so cold." "Ninty." Ned gave a faint, wry grin. "This is as warm as the north gets. We're well past winter." Silence followed, a heavy weight settling between them. Ned took a slow breath. "How have you been, Robert?" The king shrugged. "Older, fatter, surrounded by flatterers in the Red Keep. Bah, they're more trouble than they're worth." He let out a weary chuckle. "I've come to name you Hand of the King. I need you in the south, Ned. You know I hate the damn place, but a king must sit the Iron Throne. I'd prefer to drink myself into an early grave, but I'm told that wouldn't be very noble of me." "And I know, Your Grace," Ned said softly, bowing his head. But Robert could see the conflict in his friend's eyes. The north was in Ned's blood, and the man looked as if the idea of leaving made him ache. "We'll talk of that tomorrow," Robert said. His gaze flicked away. The words he had come here dreading hovered in the space between them. "It's been years," he finally managed, "since we spoke of that boy." Ned's expression didn't change. "He's done nothing, Robert. He's grown up a quiet lad, with a good heart." "Anne?" "Aye," Robert said, his throat thick. "I saw him. Spitting image of you, some might say." He paused, recalling that fleeting glimpse of Rhaegar in the lad's face. Perhaps no one else saw it, but Robert knew what to look for. "You say he's well?" Ned hesitated, and then a flicker of relief crossed his features as he realized Robert was not pressing a dagger to the matter. "He is. He wants to join the Night's Watch." The words took Robert by surprise. He sat up straighter. "He's scarcely more than a boy." 15. Ned corrected. "He has no lands to inherit, and Catelyn, well, she's never been fond of him. The Watch would give him a path. Jon wants it strongly, or so he believes." That notion churned Robert's stomach. Half of him thought that if the boy vanished to the wall, it would be simpler. No one would see Rhaegar's eyes in him, or note that he had none of Ned's Tully coloring. The other half of him almost balked. Was that truly what Lyanna would have wanted? For her son to freeze out his days on the wall, with no family but a black cloak to keep him warm? Yet that same guilt, that same vow to Ned, pressed in. Robert had once wanted Targaryen blood wiped from the face of the earth. That feeling had not entirely vanished. But neither had his love for Lyanna, or his bond with Ned, or the knowledge that sometimes the world was not as simple as war made it. Does he know? "Have you told him anything?" Robert asked, his voice rasping across the quiet. Ned's eyes flashed. "I'd never endanger him like that. He knows only that I brought him back from the south. He believes me to be his father. I'd not see him burdened with that truth, Robert, and I'd not see him hounded by your enemies." Robert nodded. 1,000 thoughts swarmed in his brain, but the weight of them was too great for a single night. "Very well," he said thickly, standing. "Let's speak more of it some other time. The hour is late, and I've drunk enough wine to float a ship." Before Ned could respond, Robert patted his friend's shoulder, then walked out of the solar. He felt Ned's worried gaze upon him, but there was nothing more to say that night. The corridor beyond felt as cold as a tomb. Shadows danced on the walls, cast by torches guttering in their brackets. As Robert made his way to the chambers prepared for him, he could not quiet his mind. The footsteps of his guards were a dull echo behind him, yet in his head memories of war hammered at his skull. Scenes from the Trident, from King's Landing, from the moment he had learned of Rhaegar's heirs, the vow he had made to end the Targaryen line. And yet he had spared one. No, not spared. The boy had been hidden from him at first, and by the time Robert knew his love for Ned, his memory of Lyanna had stayed his hand. That truth weighed heavy on him. Sleep did not come easily that night. When he closed his eyes, he saw Lyanna's face, saw her as she must have been in that tower in Dorne, giving birth in blood and fear. He saw Rhaegar's silver hair, the rubies on his armor. He felt the ache of betrayal that had never truly left him. The next day he rose early, heavy-lidded but determined to carry out the duties that had brought him here. He found Ned in the courtyard, watching his sons and Theon Greyjoy practice archery. Jon Snow was there as well, standing somewhat aside. He was not quite with his half-brothers, not quite alone. He loosed an arrow that thudded into the target. The boy's posture was tense, as if expecting censure rather than praise. Robert cleared his throat loudly as he approached, and the practice momentarily stopped. Ned turned to greet him, with Robb, Bran, and Theon giving the king respectful bows. Jon was slower to bow, perhaps uncertain. He did so at last, eyes lowered in something like shyness or wariness. Robert felt a swirl of conflicting emotions, but he took a step closer, forced a grin, and ruffled Bran's hair with one huge hand. "Well shot, all of you. If I weren't king, I'd join you for practice. It's been too long since I had a good hunt." He could sense Jon's tension, could see the boy clutching his bow with uncertain hands. Robert turned, looking directly at him. The boy's face was half in shadow beneath a lock of dark hair. "You as well, Snow. Good aim." Jon's eyes flicked up, surprised that the king even bothered to speak to him. "Thank you, your grace." To Robert's own surprise, he wanted to say more. He wanted to ask the boy about life in Winterfell, about how he fared, but that felt too raw, too close to the wound. So instead, he cleared his throat and turned back to Ned, forcing a booming laugh. "You never told me you had so many fine shots in this brood of yours, Ned." Ned put a hand on Robb's shoulder. "There's plenty of training yet to be done, but they're learning." After that, talk turned to simpler things: supply lines, the state of the roads, local harvests. Robert wanted to keep his mind busy. He was grateful when Ned proposed. They toured the ancient crypts beneath Winterfell in the afternoon, an excuse for the two old friends to walk and talk in relative seclusion. The day was bright, the sun reflecting off thin patches of snow that clung to the shady corners of the courtyard. Servants passed through, carrying sacks of grain or hauling fresh logs for the fires. When they descended into the crypts, a hush fell over them. Their torchlight flickered against rough gray walls. The faces of ancient stark statues loomed from their stone seats, deer wolves at their feet. Robert felt the press of the dead. It was a somber place. He thought of Lyanna, entombed here among her ancestors. Ned walked ahead, the torch raising flickering shadows across his face. They stopped before Lyanna's statue. Her features had been carved to resemble her as best as memory and the sculptor's skill could manage. Robert stood there, heart pounding. He knelt down, feeling the chill of the stone seep through his thick breeches. He had not been to this spot in years. He remembered the first time he had laid flowers here, back when the wound was fresh. Now he was older, heavier, and the pain had scabbed over, but never truly healed. Ned's voice was gentle. She would have been 28 by now. Robert closed his eyes. She should have lived. Everything should have been different. His voice trembled with old anger. He reached out a hand, almost touching the stone. "You lied to me," he said, more to the statue than to Ned. "Your last words were for your son. The son who carried Targaryen blood." He lowered his hand. Then, exhaling slowly, he rose to his feet. Ned stood in silence beside him, letting the king gather his thoughts. "She gave you the charge, didn't she?" Robert asked, though he knew the answer. "With her dying breath, she made you swear. And you, of course you would. Ned Stark never breaks a vow." Ned's face tightened. "I did what she asked, Robert. I protected the boy. That was all." Robert stared at Lyanna's visage, remembering the flowers he used to bring her, the illusions he had nurtured about their life together. She had never been his. The knowledge still stung. He turned away at last, his broad shoulders slumping. "Ned," he said softly, "I would speak with Jon. Not now. Not in front of everyone, but soon." "Neddy." Ned's eyes flew to Robert. "For what purpose?" "I want to see for myself who he is," Robert said. "I'm not a monster." He paused. "If I were the man I was after the trident, I might have had him killed. But I'm not that man anymore, and perhaps he's not the threat I always imagined. I only want to understand him, for Lyanna's sake." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Ned's features, but at length he nodded. "As you wish, Your Grace. But please be gentle. He's young and he knows nothing." Robert gave a curt nod. "I'll do what I can." They left the crypts in heavy silence. The daylight above ground seemed unnaturally bright after the gloom of the tombs, and Robert squinted. Later that day, the king found himself strolling through Winterfell's Godswood, a place of ancient trees, and a reflective pool at the heart. The heart tree's face was old, carved deep in the trunk, its red leaves trembling slightly in a northern breeze. Robert heard the faint trickle of water somewhere behind the thick boughs. He had never cared much for the old gods, but this place demanded a sort of hush. He followed the sound of steel. Rounding a line of thick trunks, he saw Jon practicing swordwork with Robb. They had no watchers save for a yard dog lazing nearby. The two boys traded clumsy thrusts, obviously drilling each other to keep sharp. Robert watched unnoticed for a time. Jon's movements were quick, purposeful, though not as powerfully built as Robb. He had a lean grace to him. That triggered a pang in Robert's chest. Another reminder, an echo of Rhaegar's rumored skill and almost elegant bearing on the battlefield. Or perhaps Robert was only imagining ghosts. When Robb spotted the king, he stopped mid-swing. Jon whirled, eyes widening as he found himself face to face with Robert Baratheon. Jon lowered the practiced sword, obviously not sure what to say. Robb cleared his throat. "Your Grace, we were just practicing." Robert finished with a nod. "Carry on, don't let me interrupt." But a strange tension had already settled. Robb seemed self-conscious, unsure if the king truly wanted them to continue. Jon stood there, hand tightening on the wooden hilt, gaze flicking to Robert's broad face. After a moment, Robb bowed slightly. "If it please your grace, I'll take my leave. I promised my lord father I'd attend him." Robert suspected that was only half true, but he did not press the boy. He gave a curt nod, and Robb hurried off, leaving Jon and Robert alone amid the rustling leaves. The Godswood felt very still. Robert could see the uncertain flicker in Jon's eyes. The lad clearly did not know what the king might want with him. Robert cleared his throat, drawing closer. "You fight well," he offered, voice quieter than usual. "Your stance is decent. You learned that from Sir Roderick." "Yes, your grace," Jon answered. He's taught me and Rob both, along with our brothers. Robert nodded, letting the silence stretch. Then he gestured for Jon to follow. And the boy fell into step beside him, still clutching the practice sword. They walked past the heart tree, its red eyes seeming to watch them. When Robert finally spoke, his tone was uncharacteristically subdued. "How do you fare, lad?" Jon looked puzzled by the question. "Well enough, your grace. I'm sorry if I disturbed your walk." "Not at all," Robert said. "The truth is, I wanted to speak with you. Privately." He could feel the unspoken questions swirl in Jon's mind. "Ned, your father, he tells me you want to join the Night's Watch." Jon squared his shoulders. "Yes, your grace. It's an honorable calling to guard the realms of men. And there isn't much for me here." Robert frowned, pausing by a mossy rock near the water. "You're still young, 15. A vow to the Watch is for life." The boy's jaw tightened. "I know, but I'm a bastard. The Watch is a place I can find my own honor." Robert let out a long breath, staring at Jon's face. The lad believed himself a bastard, believed he had no place else in the world. Robert wondered if that was truly the best the boy could hope for. But telling him more was not an option. He had sworn to Ned to keep the secret, and the risk would be too great. Should the realm learn the truth, chaos would follow. Robert's own lords, the Lannisters, all those who had bled to topple the Targaryens, they would demand the boy's head. And Robert could not say with certainty that he would deny them. Yet looking at the boy, Robert felt a pang of pity. "Jon Snow," he said, voice heavy. "Sometimes, we men make choices that define our fates forever. If you must take the black, do so with your eyes open. The north is cold, but the wall is colder." Jon nodded, though a flicker of emotion crossed his features. "I understand, your grace. But I'd rather do something meaningful than remain where I'm not wanted." Robert heard the hint of bitterness beneath the polite exterior. He almost wanted to apologize to the boy, to say he was wanted, in his own way. But that would raise questions he had no desire to answer. Instead, he laid one calloused hand on Jon's shoulder, noticing how the lad stood a bit straighter under the king's touch. "Ned is a good man, and you show promise. Don't forget that." He let his hand fall away. "If you are sure, if you truly want it, I won't stand in your way. The Night's Watch could use men of courage." Jon lowered his gaze, but there was a trace of gratitude there. "Thank you, your grace." For a long moment, Robert said nothing. His mind churned with the ghosts of the past. Then he turned and walked away, leaving Jon behind among the old gods. That evening, Robert withdrew to a private dinner with Ned and his family. The great feast had been the night before, so this was a smaller gathering. Ned, Lady Catelyn, their children, and the king's retinue. Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen were not present. They were with the royal party but had their own separate lodging for the night, and Cersei had not deigned to attend this intimate meal. Robert was relieved. He did not care to watch Cersei's suspicious glances. They dined on roasted pheasant, turnips in butter, and fresh bread. The atmosphere was subdued, the children speaking quietly among themselves, Lady Catelyn occasionally casting an uncertain glance toward Jon, who sat at the far end of the table. Robert tried to lose himself in the taste of the food, the dryness of the wine, anything to quell the unease in his chest. When the meal ended, Robert signaled Ned to join him on a balcony overlooking the courtyard. Torchlight flickered below as guards made their rounds. A half-moon rose in the sky, bathing the battlements in pale light. Robert leaned against the cold stone, arms folded across his broad chest. "You spoke with Jon," Ned said quietly. Robert gave a grunt. He wants the watch. He seems eager." Ned's jaw tightened slightly. "He's always wanted somewhere to belong. He thinks he can find it on the wall." Robert turned, regarding Ned under the moonlight. "And do you think he should go?" Ned was silent for a moment, his breath misting in the chill air. "I'd rather he stayed, but my wife has never accepted him, and Jon feels it. If it brings him peace, then so be it. I can't keep him caged in a place where he believes is unwanted." Robert gave a short nod. A swirl of emotions rose in him, too many to name. He recalled the shape of Jon's face, the way the lad carried himself with a mix of pride and self-doubt. There was something of Lyanna there, and the notion left an ache in his chest. If Ned had not lied, if Robert had discovered the truth before cooler heads prevailed, he could have killed the boy. That thought tasted bitter. Robert was not sure what tore at him more: the memory of Lyanna's betrayal, or the knowledge that in many ways he had betrayed her son by letting him grow up in the shadows. Ned placed a hand on Robert's arm. "I know this burdens you, but you've done right by him in your own way." Robert let out a hollow chuckle. "A strange sort of right. Better than a dagger in his ribs, I suppose." He shook his head. "I never wanted this. Gods, what a tangle." They lapsed into silence. Below, a pair of guards walked side by side, their spears reflecting torchlight. Somewhere beyond the castle walls, a wolf howled. Robert felt it resonate in his bones. The North was a land of old secrets and older loyalties. He had come here to secure Ned as his hand, to keep the realm stable. But he had walked into the arms of a past he had never truly laid to rest. As the days passed, Robert lingered in Winterfell. The official reason was rest, companionship with Ned, the forging of the alliance that would see Ned installed as hand and Sansa betrothed to Joffrey. But in truth, Robert was hesitant to leave just yet. Something about Jon Snow's presence unsettled him. He caught glimpses of the boy during the daytime, in the courtyard practicing with the sword, in the library reading with Bran, or at table, half listening to the banter of his siblings. Robert found his gaze drawn to the lad more often than he cared to admit. It was not fatherly affection he felt, nor hatred, only a complicated swirl of memory and regret. One morning, as the sun filtered weakly through a shroud of clouds, Robert watched from a balcony while Jon and Robb sparred. The ring of steel on steel drifted up to him. The power of Robb's strikes, the nimble footwork from Jon. Robert found himself with a hand on the balcony's edge, knuckles tight. He did not notice Ned approach until his friend spoke. "They're of an age," Ned said, resting an arm on the stone. "Both 15, both eager to prove themselves. They push each other to be better." Robert nodded absently. "They have the makings of good warriors, both of them." He hesitated, then, "You'll let the boy leave soon for the wall, then?" Ned exhaled. "He's determined. I told him we'd discuss it once this visit is done." A portion of Robert wanted to protest, but the words tangled in his throat. The boy was safer on the wall, out of sight. He would never marry, never sire children that might stir old claims. Yet it felt too much like banishment. Perhaps that was the only future for him. The Targaryen blood in Jon's veins made him a living threat in the eyes of many. If Robert's wrath had cooled, that did not mean the realm's memory would. The days continued, and the king's retinue made plans to depart, heading south to King's Landing, where Robert would place the responsibilities of governance heavily on Ned's shoulders. Yet, Robert delayed. He found reasons. He wanted to hunt in the Wolfswood, inspect the local holdings, or simply enjoy the North's hospitality. The truth was, he dreaded returning to the Red Keep, where Cersei and her father, Tywin Lannister, lurked with their own schemes. There was something about Winterfell that grounded him, reminded him of simpler times, even if those times were overshadowed by the greatest heartbreak of his life. One night, Robert found himself alone again in the courtyard, as the sky stretched with countless stars. He had told his guards to stay back, and so the castle was largely still. The hush was profound, broken only by a distant owl's call. In the pale light of the moon, he saw movement near the stables. Jon Snow slipping out quietly, cloak wrapped tight against the chill. The boy carried himself with a stealth that suggested he did not want to be noticed. Curiosity got the better of Robert. He followed at a distance, relying on the quiet hush of his own footfalls. Jon did not see him. He was focused on the stables, leading out a horse with practiced hands. Gently he guided the beast out of the courtyard, heading toward the postern gate. Robert watched with a furrowed brow. Was the boy running away? Had something happened? The king trailed him until Jon cleared the gate, then quickened his pace, letting his broad steps announce his presence. "Snow," he called out, voice echoing in the stillness. Jon turned abruptly, the horse giving a startled snort. Jon clutched the reins, eyes going wide. Your grace, he managed. I didn't mean. Robert lifted a hand to silence him. What are you doing sneaking off at this hour? Jon's face flushed. Sometimes I ride to the ridge beyond the castle. It's quiet there. I think about my future. Yeah. Robert eyed the horse, then the boy. I thought you might be running off to the wall already. Jon shook his head. No, your grace. I'm not that foolish. Sometimes I don't sleep well. Robert understood sleepless nights well enough. He gazed at Jon a moment, then cleared his throat. Go on then, he said. But I'll come with you. I could use some air. Jon blinked, clearly taken aback by the king's offer. Yet he nodded. As you wish, your grace. Robert retrieved his own horse from a stable hand, who looked half asleep, but sprang into motion at the king's request. Soon, they rode side by side out into the open land beyond Winterfell. Moonlight silvered the fields. In the distance, the towering trees of the Wolfswood swayed gently in a midnight breeze. Jon guided them to a small ridge where a lone weirwood stood, shorter than those in the Godswood but still crowned with red leaves. From this vantage, Winterfell's walls stood dark and quiet behind them. Robert dismounted slowly, scanning the horizon. The crisp air cleared his senses, the dull ache of too much wine receding. Jon, too, dismounted, though he kept his distance from the king, as if unsure what to say. Robert allowed the hush to linger before finally breaking it. You care about the north, he observed. Jon looked up. It's my home. Bastard or not, I've always known these lands, these forests. Robert nodded, exhaling a visible cloud of breath. I never much cared for it myself, if I'm honest. Too cold. He paused, letting the wind rustle the leaves. But it grows on you, I suppose. Jon gave a tentative smile. I suppose it does, your grace. For a long moment neither spoke. Robert let his gaze roam the distant silhouette of Winterfell. He could almost imagine how it looked in times past, how Ned and Lyanna must have run across its grounds as children. He looked at Jon, who studied the fortress as well. The boy's hair ruffled in the breeze, the moonlight catching his sharp features. And Robert thought, for just a flicker of an instant, that he saw something achingly familiar, Lyanna's spirit, or perhaps a hint of Rhaegar's quiet dignity. That notion stirred a tumult of feeling. In that moment, Robert felt an impulse to speak, to break the vow of secrecy, to say something that might ease the boy's sense of not belonging. But the vow was older and stronger than this moment. He could not gamble with the realm, or with the boy's own life. So he swallowed the words, letting them wither in his throat. Instead, he forced a half laugh. You'll be a sworn brother soon, lad, and I'll be your king. In the end, all we can do is serve, in our own way. Jon lowered his gaze. Yes, your grace. Robert mounted his horse again, the saddle creaking. Jon followed suit, and together they rode back to Winterfell, the silence between them heavy with words unspoken. When they parted in the courtyard, Robert gave the boy a nod before returning to his chambers, where no restful sleep awaited him. The next day, the king's retinue began final preparations for departure. Robert found Ned outside the great hall, giving instructions to stable hands and servants. The banners flapped overhead, the crowned stag of House Baratheon snapping in the wind beside the direwolf of Stark. Robert paused by Ned, crossing his thick arms. "We will leave on the morrow," he said. "And you'll come with me, Ned. The realm needs a hand I can trust. I'm half a fool without you." Ned inclined his head. "If it is your command, your grace, I will go. Though it pains me to leave Winterfell." Robert let out a rough sigh. "We'll bring your daughters as well. Sansa, to be betrothed to my son. And Arya too, if you wish. She'll find new experiences in the capital. Robb can stay behind to rule as your heir. As for the boy, Jon Snow, decide what you will do. If he truly wants the watch, then let him have it. I won't forbid it." "Benin." Ned studied Robert's face. "Thank you. That means more than you know." Robert waved a dismissive hand. "I'm no good with gratitude. Just make sure the realm doesn't fall apart under me. I've had enough of conspiracies. I'd rather hold a feast every day, drink half the cellars, and chase whores if it pleased me." but the damned crown weighs heavier than I expected." Ned's lips quirked in a faint smile, though sadness lingered in his eyes. "You were always a better man than you believed, Robert." A bitter laugh escaped Robert. If only that were true. Then he shook his head. "Enough talk. We'll share one more night of quiet, and then to the south." "I'll not lie, Ned. I hate that place, but it's ours to rule." That evening, the final night at Winterfell, Robert found himself on a rampart overlooking the courtyard. A torch guttered behind him, throwing dancing shadows across the stone. Below, he saw Jon Snow walk across the yard. The boy paused, looking around, his breath visible in the cold air. He seemed troubled, caught between leaving for the watch and the uncertain ties of his home. Robert felt something akin to longing or regret. He closed his eyes, remembering Lyanna's laughter, the pink petals she once wore in her hair. All of it gone, turned to dust in memory. Now only her child remained. He would keep the secret buried. He had to. Jon might well vanish north, taking the black, never knowing his true parentage. Perhaps that was for the best. Robert had a realm to rule, an iron throne to hold on to. Yet as he watched the boy below, Robert admitted a truth he had never before voiced. Part of him did not hate Rhaegar's son. He hated the memory of Rhaegar, the heartbreak of Lyanna's choice. But Jon was an innocent in all of this. And though Robert might never call him kin or friend, he no longer wished to see him harmed. Perhaps that, in its own twisted way, was enough. In the morning, the king and his host would ride south, Ned Stark at his side. Winterfell would be left behind in the hands of Robb Stark, and Jon Snow would soon depart for the Wall. The secret of Jon's birth would remain locked in Robert's heart, an uneasy alliance between duty and regret. The road ahead would be fraught with dangers, both within King's Landing and beyond. But for now, Robert Baratheon stood on the rampart, breathing the crisp northern air, reminded of a love long lost, and a vow he had once made, not with words but with his choice to let a single Targaryen child live. The gods only knew how that choice might shape the fate of the realm in days yet to come. But tonight, in the hush before dawn, he felt certain that it was a choice he could not have made differently. And so he remained, unmoving, as the eastern sky lightened and the crows stirred upon the battlements. Lost in a moment he would never entirely leave behind. Onika. Dawn broke over Winterfell in a soft haze of pewter clouds, turning the snowdrifts and ramparts a dull silver. Beneath that hushed sky, servants and guards bustled through the courtyard, loading wagons and preparing horses. The king's party, its colorful banners still furled against the chill, stretched in a line near the gates. Robert Baratheon stood by his massive warhorse, cinching the straps of his fur-lined cloak. He felt an unfamiliar heaviness as he looked upon the gray walls for what might be the last time in years. He turned to see Ned Stark walking toward him, face solemn. Beside Ned were his daughters, Sansa and Arya, who would ride south with their father. Robb Stark stood a short distance away, shoulders set with the air of someone newly burdened with responsibility. The moment Ned left, the heir would need to help rule the North in his father's absence. Nearby, Jon Snow hovered in the swirl of activity, letting stable hands pass, their arms laden with saddlebags and provisions. Jon said nothing, and Robert saw how the boy's posture spoke of an eagerness to fade into the background. Robert cleared his throat and looked at Ned. "You're sure of this, old friend? You'll leave Robb to watch over Winterfell, and with him the rest of your brood?" Ned nodded. "Robb is young, but he has a good head on his shoulders. Maester Luwin and the Castellan will assist him. The North knows how to bide its time." Robert cast a glance at the girls. Sansa curtsied, trying to contain her excitement and nerves at the prospect of journeying to the capital. Arya fidgeted at her sister's side, eyes flicking to the wagons, to the horses, then back again. She seemed barely able to stand still. Robert forced a smile, remembering how young life had once seemed so full of promise. He gestured to the line of riders. "Go with the men, girls. We'll depart soon enough." They curtsied again, then moved off. Ned's gaze drifted across the courtyard, lingering on Jon, who stood by a pillar with Ghost, his white direwolf pup, at his feet. Jon had offered to remain behind, likely not wanting to intrude upon the official farewells. But his eyes sought Ned's face as though uncertain. At length, Ned lifted a hand, beckoning him over. Jon came forward with measured steps, stopping just beyond arm's reach of Robert and Ned. He bowed his head to the king. "Your Grace," he said softly. Robert felt the question in the air, unspoken. Would Jon go now to the wall, or linger a while? Ned glanced at Robert, then addressed Jon. "Have you made your final decision?" Jon lifted his chin. "Yes, my lord. I will go to the wall. It's what I want." Robert recognized the quiet determination in the boy's voice. He remembered how he himself had once spoken with such certainty of war, of vengeance, of glory. Now, he felt only a dull ache. But he said nothing, leaving Ned to speak. Ned placed a hand on Jon's shoulder. "Then you'll ride with us for a time. When we reach the crossroads, we'll separate. Some of my men will escort you to Castle Black. I've written to Lord Commander Mormont so he knows to expect you. You'll have a proper escort." Jon swallowed, some unreadable mix of pride and apprehension in his gray eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. Then he looked to Robert. "Your Grace, I'm grateful for your mercy in letting me go." The statement brought a wave of emotion Robert could not entirely name. He simply nodded, feeling a thick tightness at the back of his throat. "The Watch is always in need of good men," he managed. "Serve well, Snow." Jon bowed again. He looked as though he might say more, but then he withdrew, returning to his place near the stables. Ghost padded at his heels, the direwolf's red eyes regarding Robert for a moment before turning away. Ned exhaled. "We'll be ready within the hour, Robert." Robert clapped Ned on the back, forcing a hearty laugh that rang hollow in the chill. "Good. The sooner we leave, the sooner we can find a warm hearth in an inn somewhere south of the Neck. These northern winds cut through me like a blade." Ned managed a faint smile, then moved off to check on final preparations. Robert remained where he was, the wind ruffling his thick cloak. He watched the swirl of activity, grooms leading horses out, wagons creaking under loaded crates, men and women calling orders across the yard. On the ramparts, a few guards stood vigil, fur hoods drawn tight. Above, the sky was pale, as if not quite decided on dawn or overcast gloom. At last, the column formed. Robert mounted his warhorse, snorting at how the animal shifted under his weight. The king's own men, Lannister guards, gold cloaks, and a handful of sworn swords from the Baratheon holdings, arranged themselves around him in a disciplined row. Ned's entourage took position close by with Sansa and Arya in a covered carriage for comfort. Though Arya poked her head out more than once, eyes wide and curious. Further down the line came some lesser lords, petitioners, and a bevy of servants. Jon Snow rode near the rear with a handful of Stark men, among them Jory Castle. Robb Stark stood by the gate, flanked by Maester Luwin. They watched solemnly as the gates were opened, and the king's column began to move. Robert inclined his head in a gesture of farewell. Robb returned it, the weight of responsibility already etched in the set of his shoulders. Thus did they leave Winterfell, traveling at a slow but steady pace across the hard-packed road that meandered southward. The north sprawled around them, a mix of dark pine forests and stretches of open tundra. The distant mountains wore crowns of ice, and the wind carried faint scents of pine sap and cold earth. Robert settled into the rhythm of the ride, letting the jingle of harnesses and the crunch of hooves fill his ears. Occasionally, he threw a glance over his shoulder, spotting Ned conferring with his men, or Sansa peering from the carriage window, or Arya dragging her gaze across the wilderness. He also noticed Jon, riding with a quiet stoicism near Jory. The boy seldom lifted his head unless spoken to, as though content to vanish into the crowd. Something about that stirred Robert's memories. He had felt that same desire once to escape the prying eyes of courtiers. That had been long ago, before he was king, before the weight of the crown made him visible at all times. They stopped at midday to rest the horses and eat a cold lunch of bread and salt beef. Robert dismounted with a groan, patting his horse's flank as he handed the reins to a groom. The men fanned out across a small clearing, some building small fires to chase away the lingering chill. Ned approached Robert, handing him a waterskin. "A quiet ride so far," Ned observed, looking around. "The roads here are well kept, thanks to the watchful eyes of my bannermen. We shouldn't have trouble." Robert took a swig from the water skin, then wiped his mouth on the back of his glove. "Good. I'm in no mood for bandits. When we reach the neck, the going might be slower, but I'd like to make haste. I've had enough nights in the open." Ned inclined his head. Then he cast a glance toward the cluster of Stark men. Jon was there, feeding ghost scraps of salted meat. A few other men crouched around, warming their hands at a small fire. "He's quiet," Ned said softly. "Always has been. But now I wonder if he's wrestling with doubts." Robert watched the lad, who was trying not to smile as Ghost devoured the treat, pink tongue flashing. "He's young," Robert murmured. "No doubt he thinks the black is his destiny. But once he's sworn those vows, there's no turning back." Ned said nothing for a moment. The men around them passed in and out of earshot, carrying gear, adjusting saddles, speaking in low tones. "If Lyanna had lived," he said at length, "we'd not be standing here like this. She would have raised him, and the truth of his parentage would have changed the world." Robert's jaw tightened. He glanced sharply at Ned, then forced his gaze away. "That secret still must die with us," he said in a rough whisper. "For the boy's sake, and for the realm's. You know as well as I do that if certain lords even suspected—" Ned nodded, brow furrowed. "I know." He looked at his hands, rough and calloused from a soldier's life. "I only wish things had been different. For Lyanna, and for him." Robert closed his eyes, feeling the old pang in his chest. "So do I," he said, voice barely audible. Then he turned away, picking up a piece of bread. "Come on, let's get moving." They rode again, covering leagues of the north's rugged terrain until the light began to fade. The king's party made camp near a small stream, setting up tents in a wide clearing surrounded by towering pines. Guards took turns patrolling the perimeter while cooks kindled fires for a hot supper. The smell of roasting onions soon drifted through the air, mingling with the crisp scent of pine needles. Robert had a large tent for himself, with comfortable bedrolls and braziers to keep the chill at bay. He unbuckled his sword belt and tossed it onto a camp stool, then sank onto a wooden chest with a heavy sigh. He heard the distant murmur of men talking, the clang of a hammer on iron. Someone was repairing a loose horseshoe, perhaps. A few moments later, Ned appeared at the tent flap, ducking inside. He looked tired but composed. "The men have everything in hand," Ned said. "I thought I'd share a cup of mulled wine with you if you like." Robert nodded, motioning for Ned to sit. One of the king's servants, a broad-shouldered man with a thinning hairline, poured 2 cups of steaming wine from an iron pot, suspended above a small brazier. The aroma of cloves and cinnamon reminded Robert of younger days, when he and Ned had wintered together in the Eyrie under Jon Arryn's care. Ned took a sip, a quiet look in his eyes. "I've told the girls to stay near the fire tonight. Sansa is excited for the next leg of the journey. She keeps asking how many days until we see the great tournaments and the marvels of King's Landing. Arya complains that riding in the carriage is dull. She wants a horse of her own." Robert chuckled. "That one has wolf's blood, I swear. Reminds me a bit of Lyanna." Then his smile turned rueful, and he fell silent. Ned traced the rim of his cup with one finger. "And Jon is with Jory and the men. He hasn't eaten much tonight, just enough to keep going. I think he's restless, a bit anxious. It's one thing to pledge yourself to the watch in your heart, quite another to set foot on that path." Outside, the wind sighed through the pines. The campfires crackled. Robert took a long swallow of the mulled wine, feeling its warmth spread through his chest. "I wonder if, in years to come, he'll regret it," he said. "The vows are for life. No marriage, no children, no inheritance. Perhaps he'll find his place, or perhaps he'll be just as lonely as he is now." Ned stared into his cup, brow tense. "We can't know. All we can do is let him choose for himself. He's old enough to decide." "None." Robert leaned back, the tense lamplight casting flickering shadows on the canvas walls. Well, the road is never what we think it is, Ned. Look at us. We fought a war, took a throne, and ended up older men with regrets enough to fill all the barrels in King's Landing. Ned's eyes flicked up, holding Robert's gaze. We won, Robert. That was supposed to make everything right. Robert let out a long breath, staring at a point on the far wall. We won, he echoed, though the words were tinged with an old bitterness. And now here we are. He finished his wine, then set the cup down. I'm going to sleep. We have another long ride tomorrow. Ned stood, nodding. Good night, Your Grace. He left the tent, the flaps swaying shut behind him. Robert sat there for a while, listening to the murmurs outside. Eventually, he rose to remove his heavy cloak and boots, laying them aside, then crawled into the makeshift bedding. The old ghosts of memory crowded him as he closed his eyes. He saw a tower in Dorne, bathed in red morning light, and then he saw Lyanna, pale and dying, pressing a bloody hand into Ned's. The dream shifted, and he saw Rhaegar's face, calm and solemn, like a reflection on water. He woke more than once that night, drifting in and out of uneasy slumber as the northern wind howled. The next days passed in slow, steady travel. Each morning they rose at dawn, broke camp, and rode until midday, stopping only to water the horses and share a short meal. Afternoons brought more miles under a sky that seemed endless, the north's landscape shifting gradually from dense pine forests to rolling hills. At night, they found what shelter they could, sometimes an abandoned holdfast, or a small clearing by a stream. Occasionally they passed villages, where curious locals peered from cottages at the grand procession. The further south they went, the fewer direwolves were heard in the distance, replaced by the rustle of smaller forest creatures. Robert maintained his kingly facade, exchanging pleasantries with local lords who came to pay respects. Hearing the half-hearted amusements of his courtiers, but inside, he wrestled with a strange disquiet. He found himself scanning the column for Jon Snow more often than was comfortable. Sometimes the boy was reading a book given to him by Ned. At other times, he was talking quietly with some of the Stark men, or practicing sword forms in the early dawn light. He never sought out Robert's company on his own, nor did Robert explicitly encourage him. Yet now and again their eyes would meet in passing, and Robert would nod in acknowledgement before looking away. One evening, the king decided to ride ahead of the main party, accompanied only by a handful of guards. He told Ned he wished to scout a suitable campsite, but in truth, he wanted a moment away from the constant press of duty. The guards trailed him at a discreet distance as he urged his warhorse onto a narrow track branching off from the main road. The air tasted of damp earth, and a scattering of crows took flight from the bare branches overhead. To Robert's mild surprise, he heard hoofbeats behind him, a single rider catching up. He turned, half expecting Ned, but instead found Jon Snow, trotting closer on a dark mare. The boy's brow furrowed when he realized the king had halted. "Your Grace," Jon said, reining in. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to intrude. One of the men said you were going ahead and—" Robert raised an eyebrow. "And you decided to follow?" Jon's cheeks reddened slightly. "Yes, but only because I thought if you needed more men." One of the king's guards approached, bowing low, but Robert waved him off. "It's fine," he said. "Let the boy come if he wants to see the road ahead." The guard nodded, falling back, leaving Robert and Jon to ride side by side for a short stretch. The path dipped between low hills, patches of snow clinging to the roots of trees. Neither spoke at first, though Robert could sense Jon's unease. The boy glanced around, one hand resting on the hilt of his sword. Robert broke the silence. "Why did you truly follow me, Snow? I'm not in need of extra protection. My guards can handle it." Jon hesitated, looking at the king with an intensity that reminded Robert, uncomfortably, of Lyanna's unwavering stare. "I only wanted to speak with you, Your Grace." Robert considered that. "Speak then." Jon swallowed. "It's about the wall, about my future. I know it's presumptuous, but I wanted to hear your thoughts." "Never mind." Robert's hands tightened on the reins. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "My thoughts? I'm no maester boy to advise you on the joys of a black cloak. You've made your choice." Jon exhaled, the crisp air fogging in front of his face. "I have." But there's a part of me that wonders if I'm doing this for the right reasons, or if I'm just running from something." The candid admission surprised Robert. He guided his horse around a fallen log, then glanced back at Jon. "What would you be running from?" Jon looked away, brow knitted. "I don't belong in Winterfell. Lady Catelyn has never hidden her dislike for me. I'm different from my siblings. I want to find a place where I can serve, where I won't shame my father's house." Robert studied the lad in silence for a moment. The forest around them felt old and still, branches creaking in a faint wind. At last, he spoke with a measured calm. "You are Ned's son in all but name. That should be enough. But the Watch is a life of hardship. Duty, sacrifice, no real comfort. If you go, do it with your head high, not bowed." Jon nodded, soaking in the words. "I'll try, Your Grace." They continued riding, the path sloping upward. Robert found himself glancing at Jon from the corner of his eye. He wanted to tell the boy more, to somehow reassure him that his worth was not in question. But all the old barriers held firm. The secret burned like a coal in his throat. Finally, he hardened his voice. "Very well. Enough talk. We'll check the next clearing for a campsite and head back." Jon inclined his head, spurring his mare forward. The conversation ended, but Robert noticed that the boy seemed lighter somehow, as though simply speaking those worries aloud had helped. Robert, however, felt no such relief. A swirl of conflicting thoughts churned within him until they rejoined the main party, at which point the usual bustle swallowed them both. They pressed on for several more days. The weather grew a touch warmer as they crossed into the region south of Moat Cailin, though the skies remained gray. At last they came to a fork in the road near a weathered milestone. Ned reined up his horse, studying the carved stone. Robert drew alongside him, frowning. "This is where we part ways for the boy?" Robert asked, nodding to the smaller path that branched north and east toward the wall. Ned sighed. "Aye? I'll send Jory and a few good men with him. They'll see him safely to Castle Black." They looked back at Jon, who sat astride his mare a short distance away, hands resting lightly on the reins. His gaze flicked between Ned and Robert. He knew this moment was upon him. Ned beckoned Jon forward, and the boy rode up, Ghost loping alongside. Ned dismounted, and Jon followed suit, the two meeting on the grassy verge. The rest of the convoy remained at a respectful distance, their voices subdued. Robert sat in the saddle, observing. He felt a knot form in his chest as Ned placed a hand on Jon's shoulder. "You are a Stark," Ned said quietly. "You may not bear my name, but you have my blood. Never forget that." Jon's eyes shone with unshed tears. He bowed his head. "Thank you for all you've done for me," he whispered. "I'll make you proud." "You already have," Ned replied. They embraced. A brief, fierce gesture. Then Ned stepped back, clearing his throat. "Jory, are you ready?" Jory Castle, a lean man with a steady gaze, nodded. "Aye, my lord. We'll ride with Jon. We can make Castle Black in good time." Robert kicked his horse forward a step, wanting to give Jon some parting words, though he felt awkward in the attempt. When Jon looked up, Robert inclined his head. "Serve well, Snow. The Night's Watch needs honorable men." Jon bowed deeply. "I will, Your Grace. And thank you." His voice wavered with something unspoken, and Robert was seized by the urge to tell him that the realm was not as cruel as it seemed, that he might yet find his place. But the moment slipped away, and Jon mounted up again. The small party tasked with escorting him turned onto the branch of the road that led north and east. Robert watched them go. Ghost trotted alongside Jon's mare, his white fur stark against the browns and greens of the surrounding brush. In a matter of minutes, the group was a small smudge on the horizon, then gone. Robert realized he had been holding his breath. Releasing it, he turned to Ned. "We should ride on," Robert said, voice gruff. "We've far to go before nightfall." Ned nodded, mounting once more. The King's Column resumed its journey south. But Robert's thoughts lingered on the young man heading toward a wall of ice. A life of cold and shadow. He wondered if Lyanna would forgive him for letting her son slip away to that harsh destiny. He could not decide whether it was an act of mercy or an act of cowardice. The land gradually changed as they rode. They left behind the bogs and marshes of the neck, entering more temperate plains. The sky softened to a gentler gray and the roads grew wider. Villages and holdfasts appeared more frequently. They passed farmers tending fields of barley, travelers heading north with wagons of goods, and a few hedge knights on the lookout for lords to serve. Sansa grew more animated each day, chattering about the capital. Arya rode a stout Garin pony now, having pleaded with Ned until he relented. She galloped around the edges of the convoy, delighting in the newfound freedom. Robert occasionally teased her, calling her Little Wolf, and she would grin, showing no fear of the king's booming voice. Ned tried to keep her reined in, but he seemed resigned to her spirit. When they stopped at inns, the locals gawked at the king's arrival, bowing and curtsying as best they could. Robert drank with them, though not quite as heavily as he might have in years past. A sense of weariness clung to him like a second cloak. The secret knowledge of Joan's parentage had always sat in his gut like a stone, but somehow, this trip reminded him that the stone had grown heavier with time. On the 20th day of their journey, they crested a rise and saw before them the wide sweep of the King's Road, stretching south toward the Trident and beyond. The wind carried a faint warmth now, and though the clouds still hung overhead, there was the promise of a milder climate. They camped that night under the branches of ancient oaks, the canopy sheltering them from a light drizzle. Robert sat near the main fire, roasting a chunk of venison on a spit. Ned joined him, as did some of the closer guards. Sansa and Arya had long since retired to their tent, with Sansa excitedly planning how she might comport herself at court, and Arya bemoaning the notion of courtesy lessons. The men spoke in low tones, trading stories of battles and hunts. Robert only half listened. Eventually the talk faded, and men drifted off to their bedrolls. Ned lingered, staring into the embers. The crackling wood cast orange shadows on his face, making his eyes seem older than they were. Robert realized with a pang that his friend had lines of worry he had not possessed years before. Or perhaps Robert himself had only just noticed. "She's looking forward to it," Robert ventured, meaning Sansa. "Shall be a fine lady in the south. My son, Joffrey. Well, may the gods help him to treat her well." Ned let out a cautious sigh. "Joffrey's a prince, raised among courtiers. Sansa idolizes the idea of being a princess. I hope he proves worthy of her faith." "Namto." Robert knew there was little point in discussing Joffrey's character. The boy was shaped as much by Cersei's influence as Robert's absence. The king nodded, picking up his cup of ale. "We'll see," he said, lifting the cup to his lips. The ale tasted sour, but he forced it down. They sat a while longer, neither man speaking of the one thing that truly lay between them. Jon Snow was likely days along toward Castle Black by now, crossing lonely terrain, heading for the end of the world. Robert found himself wrestling with a strange sense of relief and regret. The threat was contained. No one would discover a Targaryen lineage behind the high ice of the wall. Yet part of him suspected that the gods were not done with Lyanna's son. The sense of foreboding gnawed at him. They pressed on day by day, mile by mile, until at last the land grew greener, dotted with farms and small market towns. Southern lords sometimes rode out to greet the king, offering gifts of wine or hawks, or a meal in their halls. Robert accepted these gestures with practiced courtesy, though he inwardly chafed at the incessant politeness. He missed the rowdy feasts of his younger days, when he had caroused without guilt. Now, everything felt weighed down by duty. At one such stop, an unremarkable keep belonging to a minor house sworn to the Tullys, Sansa glowed at the chance to dine in the hall, praising her father's courtesy while Arya scowled at the tight-fitting gown Catelyn had packed for her. Ned, politely stoic, exchanged pleasantries with the keep's lord. Robert ate his fill of roasted duck and drank moderately. When the minstrels began to play, he slipped away, telling them he needed air. He found himself in a small courtyard, overshadowed by the keep's modest walls. A meager garden grew there, flowers and herbs, though they were wilted by the recent cold snap. Torches cast flickering lights along the stone. Robert walked slowly, letting the night's quiet envelop him. A voice drifted from a nearby alcove. a woman speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Robert paused, uncertain if he should intrude. But the voice caught his attention. "The king is here, and that means eyes are watching. We can't afford mistakes." "Memo," a man answered, though Robert could not discern the words. There was a rustling of clothing, a muffled exclamation, then silence. Robert realized he was eavesdropping on a private conversation. With a scowl, he took a step back, boots scraping on the cobbles. Instantly the voices stopped. A figure emerged from the shadows. A minor courtier who had joined the king's train at some earlier stop. The man froze upon seeing Robert. He was young, with anxious eyes and an embroidered doublet that bore no notable sigil. Behind him was a woman Robert did not recognize, a maid or perhaps a lesser lady of the keep, face flushed. "Your Grace," the man stammered, dipping into a stiff bow. We were just taking some air, I'm sure," Robert said, his tone hard. He had little patience for petty intrigues. "Go about your business." The man seemed relieved at the dismissal, hastily pulling the woman away into another passage. Robert exhaled sharply. The capital was full of such secret trysts and whispered plots. Here, in this minor keep, it was the same. The world seemed overrun with conspiracies, big and small. Sometimes he almost missed the clarity of the battlefield, where a man's foes were in front of him, not lurking behind smiles and courtesies. He left the courtyard, returning to the hall in time to see the host pressing more wine upon Ned, who politely refused. Sansa was still enthralled by the music, while Arya looked ready to slip under the table out of boredom. Robert signaled that it was time to retire, and the party soon broke up, leaving the local lord effusive in his farewells. They departed early the next morning, forging on until the horizon revealed the wide waters of the Trident. Crossing that great river took the better part of a day, with Robert's guards ensuring the ferry was secured for the king's use. By evening, they could see the outlines of houses and farmland belonging to the Riverlands, bustling with activity in the harvest season. The next few days saw them pass through territory more populous, with inns more frequent, roads better kept, and travelers going in both directions. Merchants hauling wagons of grain, pilgrims heading to distant septs, hedge knights seeking tournaments, all stepped aside for the king's retinue. News of Robert's approach spread ahead of them, so that when they arrived at a sizable market town, the people lined the roads to catch a glimpse of the king, Lady Stark, and the Stark daughters. Robert forced a smile for the crowds, raising a hand in greeting. He saw a few children cheering, a handful of old men bowing. Once upon a time, he had enjoyed the adulation, the sense of being beloved. Now, it felt like a performance he could not quite bring himself to believe. One crisp afternoon, they stopped by a sparkling creek flanked by willows, giving the horses a chance to drink. Robert dismounted, stretching his stiff legs. Ned joined him, and they strolled a short distance from the column to stand beside the water. Leaves drifted on the surface, swirling in the gentle current. Ned sighed, looking south. "We're drawing close, another week or so, and we'll be nearing the capital." Robert nodded, a faint frown creasing his brow. "Back to the Red Keep," he muttered. "Cersei, the council, the politicking." He trailed off. "I almost envy the boy on his way to the wall. Free all that nonsense." "Almost." Ned's face tightened at the mention of Jon. He said nothing, but the silence was telling. Robert could sense the swirl of unspoken regret in his friend. He set a hand on Ned's shoulder. "We did what we had to, Ned. For the realm, and for him." Ned let out a slow breath. "Yes." He stared at the rippling water. "I hope one day he'll understand." Robert nodded. The burden of secrets weighed on them both, an old chain they could never fully throw off. They lingered there in silence until the call went up to ride again. Reluctantly, they returned to the lines of horses and wagons, resuming the journey that would take them to King's Landing and all the uncertain future waiting there. In the evenings that followed, Robert found himself drifting to memories with each crackle of the campfire. He remembered how, before the rebellion, he and Ned had spoken of the lives they wanted. Robert with his beloved Lyanna, Ned with a lady who shared his sense of honor and duty. In a cruel twist, Ned had found that lady in Catelyn and raised a family. Robert had lost Lyanna and gained a kingdom, but no true happiness. The child Lyanna had born in secret was out of his reach, hidden beneath the black cloak of the Night's Watch. And still, the wheels of fate turned. Perhaps that was the worst of it, the sense that nothing truly ended, that consequences fanned out across time, unstoppable. With each passing day, the king could almost hear the old gods, and the new whispering that he was but a piece in a greater game. Finally, they rode past the grand gate that opened onto the Crownlands, the farmland gradually giving way to the outlying villages and fields that fed King's Landing. The city itself still lay some days ahead, but the bustling presence of more travelers, more caravans, signaled the approach to the heart of the realm. Robert felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He glanced at Ned, who rode nearby, the wind ruffling his cloak. Ned's expression was one of resigned determination. Neither looked forward to the machinations awaiting them, but duty called. Behind them, Sansa and Arya gawked at every new sight, each orchard and windmill. Their innocence was a small light in the gloom Robert carried. He forced himself to be kingly once more, to feign enthusiasm for their delight. But at night, when the torches burned low and the hush settled, he would slip away in his thoughts, remembering a boy with gray eyes, riding north to the Wall, never knowing how close he had come to a different fate. Robert closed his eyes against those thoughts, telling himself that the past could not be undone. On a misty morning, the final leg of their journey began. Rising early, they mounted up and moved out, the King's Road stretching ahead like a gray ribbon. Robert set his jaw, spurring his horse forward. Ned rode beside him, Sansa and Arya following with a few handmaids. The rest of the retinue spread out behind. The capital waited for them, a vast sprawl of stone and ambition, rumor and intrigue. Robert could already picture the Red Keep perched upon its hill, the Iron Throne cold beneath the vaulted ceilings. With each hoofbeat, the memory of Winterfell receded, the solemn presence of the crypts, the hidden truth of Lyanna's child. Robert did not know what storms might come, but he felt the first rumblings in his heart. The realm was uneasy. He had felt it in the tension among his lords, in the half-forgotten resentments that lingered after the rebellion. He only hoped that what he and Ned had done, what they continued to do, would hold the kingdom together. They rode into the distance, banners snapping in the wind, the sunlight shifting through broken clouds. And somewhere far to the north, Jon Snow journeyed ever closer to the towering wall, into a new life shaped by oaths and shadows, never guessing that in a secret shared by two men, his name was more than snow. In that silence between them, a spark of fate glowed, destined to shape not only his life, but perhaps the fate of all the Seven Kingdoms. E.K. The farmland around King's Landing stretched outward like a quilt of brown earth and green shoots, dotted here and there with the first bursts of wildflowers. The royal procession moved along the broad road at a measured pace, surrounded by locals, who paused their work to watch the king ride past. Ned Stark rode close at Robert's side, his back straight in the saddle, though no one could have missed the traces of concern on his face. Sansa and Arya, in a small carriage nearby, peered out at the scenes of the Crownlands, their eyes filled with curiosity. The air smelled faintly of spring's promise, a welcome change after the chill of the north. Robert could see the distant shape of the city walls, hazy with distance but unmistakable in their enormity. Beyond them rose the Red Keep, perched on its high vantage, the beating heart of the realm. Each step closer to that fortress made Robert's chest feel tighter. He thought of the intrigues that thrived in its corridors, the uneasy peace he was meant to maintain, and the secret knowledge lodged in his mind like a dagger's tip. Jon Snow was now many leagues behind them, riding north to the Wall. Robert found himself thinking of the boy more often than he cared to admit, but there was little time to dwell on that now. The capital awaited, along with 1,000 responsibilities he could not shirk. They crossed an ancient stone bridge spanning a slow-flowing river, the water reflecting the pale sky. Merchants' boats drifted by, their sails limp in the weak breeze. Guards wearing the royal stag of Baratheon had been sent ahead to clear the way, so the roads were well ordered, with peasants lining up on either side to glimpse the king. A few men called blessings. Robert raised a gauntleted hand in acknowledgement. He was too tired to muster much of his old bombast. His body felt heavier each year, his mood just as burdened. He glanced at Ned. "We'll be at the city gates before sundown," he said. "Likely half the court will be waiting to greet us, eager to make a show, Cersei included." Ned grimaced almost imperceptibly. "We'll do what decorum demands. After that, I'd prefer a quiet chamber where we can speak plainly." Robert nodded. A quiet chamber. The realm's matters won't wait, but I've had enough of pretenses. I want to seat you on the small council without delay. We'll do the ceremony, then retreat to someplace private. Namely. The rest of the ride was uneventful, though the crowds grew thicker the nearer they came to the city. King's Landing's walls, high and weathered, rose ahead. Above them soared the towers of the Red Keep, their red stone walls flaring in the last angled rays of afternoon light. The gate yawned open, flanked by gold cloaks holding pikes. A herald in bright livery sounded a trumpet call as the king's party passed beneath the arch. The noise of the city engulfed them at once. Shouting street vendors, bleating animals, the clatter of wagon wheels on cobblestone. Sansa's eyes were wide as she took in the cramped buildings and the crowds pressing in, while Arya craned her neck to see a knife juggler performing near the roadside. Robert guided his warhorse onward, ignoring the smell of refuse that lingered behind the stalls. Farther in, the streets widened, kept somewhat cleaner by the city watch. Noblefolk on horses or in litters paused to bow or curtsy as the king passed. At last, they wound up the steep hill toward the Red Keep's massive gates. A line of guards stood to greet them, some in the gold and crimson of House Lannister, others in the royal stag. Robert caught sight of Jaime Lannister at the forefront, shining in his Kingsguard armor, a gilded sword pommel glinting at his hip. Behind him, a flash of emerald and golden hair. Cersei, the queen, waiting with regal composure. The rest of the court clustered around, little birds anxious for the slightest gossip. Robert halted his horse before Cersei. She inclined her head the bare minimum required, offering him a cool smile. "My lord husband," she said, her voice carrying the poise of a polished courtesan, "we've awaited your return with eagerness." "Cersei," he replied, dismounting with a grunt. "I trust everything here runs smoothly. This is my good friend, Lord Eddard Stark, who'll serve as hand of the king." Ned swung down from his saddle. He bowed to Cersei. "Your Grace," he said, polite but reserved. Cersei's eyes flicked over him, then drifted to Sansa, Arya, and the remainder of the party. "Welcome to King's Landing," she said evenly. She directed a practiced smile at the girls, though Sansa seemed the only one half charmed by it. Arya had already turned her attention to the courtyard archers above. Jaime Lannister stepped forward, posture as proud as a lion. "We're honored by your safe return, Your Grace. Allow me to escort you all inside." His gaze flicked over Ned with an edge of amusement, but he offered no open insult. The king and his retinue proceeded into the Red Keep's vast courtyard, where stable hands rushed forward to gather the horses. Servants bustled to unload wagons while the lords and ladies filed up the steps into the keep. Robert's mood soured further when he saw pettier Baelish, Littlefinger, lurking near the entrance, a sly tilt to his smile. Lord Varys was not far behind, clad in soft slippers and voluminous robes, hands folded across his waist. Behind them came Grand Maester Pycelle, leaning on a staff. Robert felt a headache forming. They proceeded with formalities, exchanging courtesies, though Robert kept his words brusque. At last, they ushered Ned and the Stark girls to their new chambers. Ned and Robert agreed to meet later that evening for a private talk. Only then, as the bustle subsided, did Robert allow himself to trudge up the winding corridors toward his own chambers, Cersei trailing behind with a polite entourage. Once inside, he dismissed the servants and turned to face his wife. Cersei stood near the window, arms folded beneath her breasts. Her green eyes flicked over him, assessing. "You look exhausted," she said, though her tone held little warmth. "Was the journey so trying?" Robert shrugged out of his cloak and tossed it over a chair. "Long, yes. The north is a far cry from here. Neperevan. I've heard rumors." Cersei continued, stepping closer. "Whispers that you went there to name Eddard Stark as hand. Now you've brought him back with you." He turned, meeting her gaze. "That's right. With Jon Arryn gone, I need someone I can trust. You'd prefer my brother Renly, or your father Tywin, perhaps Jaime himself?" Her lips curved in a faint smile. "You know my thoughts on the matter. But if you think Ned Stark suits you, so be it. We shall see how the man fares in the pit of vipers that is our capital." Robert bristled at her tone. "Pit of vipers indeed," he muttered. "I've had enough for one day. We'll talk tomorrow if you must. Summon me if something urgent arises, otherwise leave me be." Cersei inclined her head, offering no argument. She turned on her heel and left. Robert stood in silence for a long moment, staring out the high window. The city sprawled below, rooftops an uneven sea of tiles. The waters of Blackwater Bay gleamed in the fading light. He felt none of the homecoming he might have once savored. A sense of foreboding hung over him, a tension he could not shake. That evening, as the Red Keep settled into the hush after a perfunctory feast, Robert found Ned waiting in a smaller solar near the council chambers. A single candelabra lit the table, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. Ned rose when Robert entered, bowing slightly. Robert motioned for him to sit. They settled at the table, a decanter of wine between them. Robert poured 2 cups, pushing one toward Ned. "We can speak freely here," he said. "No spies behind the curtains, not tonight at least." Ned folded his hands. "There's much to do," he began. "Jon Arryn's books and accounts. I'll have to review them carefully. But if we speak of this in earnest, I wonder whether you truly want me prying into what he left behind." Jon Arryn was investigating something before his death. "Do you have any notion what it might have been?" Robert frowned, swirling the wine in his cup. "I know he was concerned about possible corruption. Or maybe he was poking into my children's lineage to feed rumors. The man would never say it outright, but he had a way of dancing around matters. I can't say. We'll find out soon enough." Ned's expression tightened. "We must be cautious. Many at court have secrets, and many profit from them. If I were to guess, someone had reason to silence Jon Arryn. We must discover who and why." Robert nodded, though his thoughts strayed to a different secret. If Jon Arryn had uncovered the truth of Jon Snow's parentage, it could have spelled chaos. But that question was moot now. He had died too soon to reveal anything. All the same, Robert felt a shiver of worry at the possibility that someone else might be searching for hidden Targaryens. Unbidden, he recalled the news from Essos about Viserys and Danarian, still exiled across the narrow sea. He took a gulp of wine. "We'll deal with the intrigues, but I have something else on my mind. This arrangement with Sansa and Joffrey. I want it done properly, a royal betrothal to keep the North tied closely to the crown. Are you in agreement?" Ned nodded, though his wariness showed. "I am. Sansa seems taken with the idea, but I'll be watchful. Joffrey has been shaped by his mother." Robert exhaled, rubbing a hand across his face. "A pity. The boy might turn out all right, but it's hard to say. He's proud, quick to anger. If only I had the sense to keep him in check when he was younger." His gaze flicked to Ned. "But you'll be here now. As hand, you can help me moderate him." Ned managed a faint smile. "I'll do my best, Your Grace." The night wore on. They spoke of lords to appease, petitions to consider, the next small council meeting. By the time Robert stood to leave, the candles had burned low. Ned lingered, scribbling notes about finances and tax levies. Robert clapped him on the shoulder. "I'm glad to have you here, truly." Then he left, heading for his bed in a weary haze. In the darkness of his chambers, Robert lay awake, haunted by old memories. He thought of Jon Snow, riding north in the gloom, the boy's face a mingling of features he recognized and features he'd rather forget. He dreamed of Lyanna, and the war, and what might have been if fate had bent differently. Far to the north, the wind howled across empty moors and stony ridges. Jory Castle led Jon Snow and the small escort onward, day by day, until the last farmland fell behind them. They slept under ragged tents when the weather was foul, and under open skies when it was clear. The nights were cold, the mornings colder still. Ghost padded alongside Jon's horse, or scouted ahead, his white fur a spectral blur against the pale hills. They rarely encountered travelers here. The road was little more than a track beaten by the watch supply wagons. At times, mist would rise off the lowlands, turning the world gray and formless. Jory kept a steady pace, mindful of the horse's endurance. Jon rode in silence much of the time, lost in thought. One evening, they made camp in a hollow, by a half-frozen stream. A scattering of pines offered meager shelter from the biting wind. Jory knelt by the fire he'd built, stirring embers, while two other Stark men, Hal and Kennett, unpacked salted pork and onions. Ghost curled near Jon's feet, tail wrapped around his body. Jon took a morsel of pork and offered it to the direwolf. He watched the flames dance, remembering the parting at the crossroads, where he'd left his family behind. Jory glanced at him. "You've been quiet, Jon. The journey wears on a man, I know, but it's more than that, isn't it?" "Share." Jon hesitated, then shrugged. "Just thinking of what lies ahead. I've never been to Castle Black." Jory nodded, rummaging in the supplies for a scrap of cloth to wipe his hands. "I've seen it once or twice when your Lord Father sent me with messages. It's not like other castles, I'll say that much. The wall is vast, bigger than you can imagine. You'll feel small standing before it. We all do." Jon stared at the fire, imagining a colossal barrier of ice rising out of the wilderness. "I'm ready," he said, though he spoke softly, as if trying to convince himself. Hal, a gruff man who'd served House Stark for a decade, offered a morsel of encouragement. "You're still young. The Watch might be a hard life, but men there take pride in their duty. You'll have a chance to prove yourself, earn respect." He looked Jon over. "Ned Stark's blood runs in your veins, bastard name or no." Jon gave a small nod of thanks. He closed his eyes briefly, recalling the king's strange kindness. Robert Baratheon had looked at him in ways he couldn't entirely fathom, as though searching for something in his face. Jon felt an odd pang at the memory, but he shrugged it aside. What did it matter? He was on his way to the wall. All else was behind him. The next day they pressed on, the terrain growing rougher as they climbed in elevation. Mossy boulders littered the hills, and patches of snow clung to the northern slopes. Ghost often vanished for hours, then reappeared with a silent tread, muzzled damp from some stream. Jon's breath fogged in the chill air, and he pulled his cloak tighter, forcing himself to endure. He had no illusions about the cold that awaited him at the wall. Summer was still upon the realm, or so they said, but the nights felt biting enough to be winter already. A week slipped by in this manner. Nights around the fire, days in the saddle, always heading north. Jon fell into a somber routine. Now and then, a flicker of excitement would spark in his chest. He was leaving behind the uncertainties of Winterfell, forging his own path, but another part of him felt hollow, as though he were missing some final piece of understanding. The king's look, his father's gray farewell, something about it all nagged at him. As they drew closer to the wall, the land flattened into a broad tundra, dotted with low shrubs and the occasional twisted pine. The wind picked up, persistent and sharp. On the last morning of their journey, Jory pointed ahead. "There," he said. "We should see it by midday, if the weather stays clear." Jon peered into the distance, seeing nothing but a thin line of horizon. He could smell a hint of ice in the air, a crispness that stung his nostrils. He urged his horse forward, anxious and apprehensive all at once. They rode on. A pale sun climbed the sky, wreathed by gauzy clouds. Then suddenly Jon saw it, a vast pale shadow on the horizon, stretching as far as the eye could follow. At first he thought it a trick of the light or low clouds, but it did not move with the wind. It was the wall, 300 miles long, 700 feet high, made of ice piled over centuries. Jon's throat went tight. He pulled up, the horse snorting in protest. Ghost stood beside him, hackles slightly raised. "It's impossible," Jon murmured, awed. Jory reined in beside him. It feels that way. But there it is, and you'll be standing beneath it by nightfall." They resumed the ride, the great wall of ice looming larger with every mile. At last, they came upon the perimeter of Castle Black. A ramshackle fortress crouched in the wall's shadow. Smoke curled from its chimneys, and figures moved upon the grounds. Wooden palisades and crude fences marked the boundaries. A gate stood open, watched by black-cloaked men with hoods drawn up. Jon felt a rush of nerves. This was to be his new home. They passed through the gate without ceremony, Jory announcing their purpose to a guardsman. Inside, the courtyard was hard-packed earth, dotted with training dummies and a few old wooden sheds. A cluster of black brothers paused in their chores to eye the newcomers. Ghost stuck close to Jon's side, ears perked. Jon's heart hammered as he dismounted. An older man with a stout build and weathered features approached. He wore black like the rest, but carried himself with authority. "I'm Sir Alliser Thorne," he said curtly, glancing between them. "What do we have here?" Jory stepped forward. "We bring Jon Snow, son of Lord Eddard Stark. He's come to take the black." Thorne's upper lip curled. "Another highborn whelp. Splendid. Lord Commander Mormont's in the King's Tower. He'll decide what to do with you. As for the wolf, keep it leashed, or you'll answer for it." Jon felt a flash of defiance, but he bit it back. "Ghost is well trained," he said evenly. Thorne's disdain was palpable, but Jon reminded himself that he was here to serve, not to quarrel. Jory laid a hand on Jon's arm. "We'll go with you to meet the Lord Commander." They led the horses away, stable hands in black taking them. Jon's heart thudded as they made their way across the courtyard, passing more black brothers, some old, some young, most with grim eyes and stooped shoulders. A few had the broken noses and missing teeth of hardened criminals. Jon wondered what life he was truly stepping into. They found Lord Commander Jorah Mormont in a chamber warmed by a blazing fireplace. The man rose from a rough-hewn chair, his broad shoulders cloaked in black fur. He had a hard face, but his eyes were shrewd, taking in the new arrival. "So, Ned Stark's boy. We've heard you were coming." His voice rumbled with quiet authority. "I see you brought a direwolf, the first we've had here in some time." Jon bowed his head. "My lord," Mormont gestured. "We aren't lords here, Snow. We're brothers, but I appreciate the respect. You've come at a busy time. We're training new recruits, preparing for winter rations, and short on everything but cold nights. You'll start in the steward's barracks, train with the rest. We'll see how you fare. We'll see how you fare." He glanced at Jory. "You've brought him safely. Any messages from Ned Stark?" Jory produced a small scroll, sealed with the direwolf. Mormont accepted it and set it aside. "I'll read that shortly," he said. "For now, get some rest, Snow, and speak with Maester Aemon to record your name in our rolls. You'll be fitted for black garb tomorrow." Jory turned to Jon, clasping his forearm. "We'll stay a night before heading back, but this is where I leave you. May the gods watch over you." Jon tried to steady his breathing. "Thank you, Jory. Thank you for everything. And thank you to my father for sending you." "Naaman Mishol." Jory gave a hint of a smile. "Your father is proud of you. Remember that." With that, Jon stood alone as Jory and the other Stark men retreated, leaving him in the chilly corridor. Ghost pressed against his leg. The castle's dim halls echoed with footsteps, voices calling orders, the clang of metal from the armory. Jon stepped out into the courtyard again, breathing in the sharp northern air. Above him, the wall loomed, an immense presence that seemed almost alive with the cold. Jon told himself he was ready for this, that here, at last, he would find his purpose. Back in King's Landing, Ned Stark's duties as Hand began in earnest. He took up residence in the Tower of the Hand, a modest suite of rooms with a small courtyard. Sansa and Arya found themselves in the labyrinth of the Red Keep, discovering new corners each day, while a string of septas and maidservants tried to guide them. Robert summoned Ned to a small council meeting on the fourth morning after their arrival. The council chambers, with their long table of polished oak, were occupied by the usual suspects. Lord Varys, who smiled with unsettling politeness. Petyr Baelish, leaning back in his chair with a mocking tilt to his lips. Grand Maester Pycelle, nodding in and out of attention. And Renly Baratheon, Robert's younger brother, clad in green and gold. Robert presided over the table, looking vaguely irritated as he listened to a petition about grain prices. Ned slipped in quietly, bowing his head to the king. The meeting dragged through various points: disputes about tariffs, the cost of the royal household, the possibility of a tourney to celebrate Ned's appointment as Hand. Robert seemed uninterested in most details, deferring to Ned to make sense of the finances. Littlefinger offered sly suggestions about ways to raise coin, which Ned politely rebuffed. Varys murmured about certain unrest in the Westerlands. Through it all, Robert tapped his fingers restlessly on the tabletop, glancing at Ned from time to time as if to say, "This is yours to manage, old friend." At last the meeting ended, and the council members drifted away. Robert caught Ned by the arm. "Walk with me," he said. They left the council chambers, descending a wide staircase that led to an inner courtyard. Robert's personal guard trailed them at a discreet distance. In the courtyard, gnarled fruit trees spread their branches over tidy flower beds. The air felt slightly cooler here, shaded from the sun. Robert led Ned to a stone bench near a trickling fountain and sat heavily. "Tell me, Ned," he said in a low voice, "how do you find the court so far?" Ned joined him, clasping his hands. "It's as I remember, only worse. Everyone has an angle, a scheme. And I see tension between your brother Renly and the others. Lord Varys' talk of unrest in the Westerlands might be rumor, or might be something more. The Lannisters have their own designs." Robert grunted. "The Lannisters always do. Cersei's father grows older, but not less cunning. I should have learned that lesson long ago. Now I'm shackled by their power." Ned hesitated. "There's talk of the Targaryen exiles," he ventured, voice low. "Some say Viserys means to wed his sister to a Dothraki warlord. Do you have any concerns about that?" "No." Robert's jaw tightened. "Dothraki. They're savages, but so are dragons. If they come across the sea, it could be trouble. My council wants me to take action, to hire assassins perhaps. I'm wary of that road. Murdering a girl across the sea doesn't sit well with me. Even if she's the Mad Kin's spawn." Ned inclined his head. "I share your reservations." He paused, then continued. "But if they rally an army, it might threaten the realm." Robert ground his teeth. "That's why we have to be vigilant. You know how I once felt about Targaryens, all of them." He paused, a flicker of conflict passing over his face. "But times change, and I don't want to be known as a baby killer." Ned nodded, understanding the underlying tension in Robert's words. Robert might be recalling that he let one Targaryen child remain unscathed, Lyanna's son. That fact weighed unspoken between them. Robert took a deep breath and stood, gesturing toward the castle. "Come on, let's get out of here. We'll go hunting tomorrow, clear our heads for a day." Ned rose to follow. "Very well, Your Grace. But who'll mind the realm while we're off chasing boar?" "Not to see." Robert laughed, a short, mirthless bark. "Let the council bicker. We need the peace of the forest at least once. We can bring your daughters if they want to ride, though I suspect only Arya might enjoy it." They walked together through the castle halls, their footfalls echoing on the stones. Servants bowed as they passed. Robert's posture was tense despite his attempt at levity, and Ned felt the same tension in himself. They were wading into a tide of rivalries in King's Landing, each wave threatening to drag them under. The next morning, Robert kept his word, assembling a small hunting party. Arya, clad in a plain tunic and leggings beneath a borrowed leather jerkin, bounced on her toes in excitement. Sansa declined, preferring to remain behind with the ladies of the court. Ned accompanied them, as did a handful of guards, none of them Lannisters by Robert's request. "I want my own men about me, not Cersei's," he said. They rode out of the city at dawn, crossing the muddy fields and heading toward the King's Wood, where boar and deer roamed. The fresh air cleared some of the lingering unease in Robert's mind. He urged his horse into a canter, feeling for a moment the exhilaration of old. Arya rode behind them, eyes shining. "Can I use a bow, father?" she asked, and Ned sighed but agreed, with the king's hearty support. They tracked a wild boar through the undergrowth, the hounds baying. Robert hefted his spear with practiced ease, crashing through the brush in pursuit. Ned and the others flanked him. Arya followed at a safer distance, brandishing her bow like a short sword. The boar charged through a thicket, scattering leaves, tusks glinting. Robert bellowed a laugh, hurling his spear. He struck the beast's flank, though not fatally. It let out a squeal and veered off, blood spattering on the leaves. Ned dismounted to finish the job, but Arya, swift as a cat, notched an arrow. She hesitated, remembering her father's caution about letting the king take his prize. Robert stepped forward, retrieving his spear. The boar, wounded and enraged, stamped at the ground. Robert turned his head to grin at Arya. "Go on, little wolf. Show me your aim." She loosed the arrow. It flew true, catching the boar in the side. With a great thrash, the creature stumbled, and Robert drove his spear home. The beast collapsed in a spray of dirt and leaves, its squeal echoing once more before dying away. Robert stood there, chest heaving, then let out a triumphant roar. Arya hurried closer, though Ned kept a watchful eye in case the animal still had life in it. "Good shot," Robert said, voice booming, clapping Arya on the shoulder. "Remind me never to get on your bad side." Arya beamed, face flushed with excitement. Ned watched, relief tempered by paternal worry. He approached, carefully removing the arrow from the carcass. The boar was huge, nearly as big as a horse's chest. Its tusks were wickedly curved. Robert placed a foot on its side, laughing. "We'll feast tonight," he declared. They loaded the boar onto a makeshift litter and trekked back. The guards took turns hauling it. Arya recounted every detail to Ned, who listened with a mixture of amusement and caution. Robert was pleased to see them bonding, the tension of King's Landing momentarily forgotten. The sun rose higher, gilding the canopy in warm light. For a time, the world felt simpler, like the old days when Robert had roamed the forests with friends he trusted. But as they approached the city walls again, the mood shifted back to wariness. Robert's shoulders tensed. The hustle and grime of King's Landing enveloped them, and the Red Keep loomed ahead, a reminder that every respite was temporary. Still, Robert resolved to savor Arya's grin a moment longer. If the gods were kind, there would be more hunts to share before the weight of the throne smothered all joy. Inside the castle, they found that the small council had convened again in their absence. Cersei's message was waiting. An urgent matter required the king's attendance. Robert handed the carcass of the boar to the kitchen servants, instructing them to prepare a feast, then strode off with Ned to the council chambers. Arya peeled away to see her sister, brimming with excitement. They entered to find Cersei seated in Robert's usual chair, Jaime Lannister at her side, Littlefinger leaning against the wall with an amused smirk, and Varys standing with his hands folded. Attention filled the air. Cersei rose at their approach, a slow, regal movement. "Oh, good of you to join us," she said to Robert. "We have news from the Westerlands. Bandits near Lannisport, so they claim. My father writes that they've been dealt with, but we must be certain these are not Ironborn raiders. The last thing we need is a threat on the western coast." Robert grunted, taking in Jaime's smug posture. "Tywin can handle a few bandits. Why drag me into it?" Jaime spoke, his voice a smooth drawl. "My lord father only wished to keep you informed. Rumors have a way of growing, and we wouldn't want the realm panicking unnecessarily." Ned exchanged a quick glance with Robert, reading the subtext. The Lannisters were letting the king know that they maintained power in their own domain without needing the crown's interference. Robert scowled, not bothering to hide his annoyance. "Very well. Let him do as he pleases. If he needs the crown's aid, he can ask for it plainly." Cersei's eyes flicked to Ned. "Lord Stark as hand, you must realize how delicate these matters can be. The realm is large, and each region has unique challenges. Don't you agree?" "Nam Piton." Ned gave a polite nod. "The Westerlands have always managed their own security. I see no reason for the crown to intervene unless Tywin requests it." A faint smile touched Cersei's lips. "Excellent. Then the matter is settled. You may go, dear husband," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "And enjoy your boar feast." Robert clenched his jaw but did not linger. He turned, nodding for Ned to follow. As they left, they heard Littlefinger murmur something under his breath, drawing a tinkling laugh from Cersei. It grated on Robert's nerves, but he forced himself not to react. He could feel Ned's controlled anger at his side. Outside the council chambers, they paused in the corridor. Robert turned to Ned, voice low. The Lannisters push their power in my face. Tywin rules half the realm's gold, and I sit here on the Iron Throne with empty coffers. That is the crux of it. Ned inclined his head. We'll need to address the realm's debt, as Jon Arryn had started to. But that's a task for another day. For now, let's see if we can keep the peace. Robert let out a long breath, feeling the enormity of it all. Keep the peace. Meanwhile, somewhere out there, Viserys Targaryen might be forging alliances with Dothraki, or bandits might be stirring in the Westerlands, or the Ironborn might be plotting raids. And all I want is to drink a horn of ale and forget it. Ned laid a hand on his shoulder. We'll manage, Robert. We always have. But Robert was not so sure. The secret he carried was a wound that refused to heal, and each passing day in this nest of vipers threatened to reopen it in unpredictable ways. He knew the game was more dangerous than ever, and all the while, the boy he had spared, Lyanna's son, was hidden away beyond the wall. Perhaps that was the only mercy Robert had managed in a life defined by battles and betrayals. He prayed, in his own rough way, that the gods would not punish him further. But the realm had a way of exacting its dues, and as he and Ned parted in the corridor, Robert felt the faint stir of dark wings overhead, a whisper of storms yet to come.